The 1970s are often remembered as a decade of shag carpets, disco lights, and heavy polyester. But beneath the vibrant pop culture was a social landscape undergoing a seismic shift. If you grew up in this era, your childhood wasn't just defined by Star Wars or bell-bottoms. It was defined by a unique psychological experiment that occurred in real time. In developmental psychology, we often look at environmental scaffolding, the support systems provided by parents and society. In the 70s, that scaffolding didn't just lean, it was largely dismantled. Today, we're diving into the psychology of the Latchkey Generation. We'll explore how a decade of social upheaval, parental absence, and economic stagflation forged a specific psychological profile, one marked by fierce independence, a deep-seated cynicism, and a peculiar get-on-with-it resilience. To understand the 1970s child, we have to look at the crumbling of the 1950s nuclear family. By the mid-70s, divorce rates were skyrocketing. Simultaneously, the second wave of feminism and economic necessity pushed millions of mothers into the workforce for the first time. The result? A latchkey kid. Millions of children returned from school to empty houses, wearing house keys on strings around their necks like urban talismans. From a psychological perspective, this created a massive spike in self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is the belief in one's ability to succeed in specific situations or accomplish a task. Without an adult to mediate their problems, 70s children learned to navigate the world alone. They cooked their own snacks, mediated their own sibling rivalries, and managed their own time. While this fostered a legendary sense of independence, it also fostered a premature autonomy. Psychologists note that when children are forced to be little adults too soon, it can lead to an avoidant attachment style in adulthood, a tendency to rely only on oneself because, historically, the grown-ups weren't there. If you look at modern parenting, it is defined by safetyism. In the 1970s, safety was an afterthought. This was the era of lead paint, no seatbelts, and playground equipment made of jagged metal over asphalt. Psychologically, this environment functioned as a form of exposure therapy. Children were constantly calculating physical risks. If you fell off the monkey bars, there was no safe surface to catch you. You learned the immediate physical consequences of gravity and momentum. This created a generation with a high risk tolerance. However, there was a darker side to this lack of supervision. The 70s was also the decade of the stranger danger panic, fueled by high-profile kidnappings and the rise of the serial killer in the public consciousness. 70s children lived in a paradox. They were granted total freedom to roam miles from home, yet they were warned that every windowless van was a potential death trap. This created a baseline of vigilant anxiety, a psychological state where one is highly functional but constantly scanning the environment for threats. Sociologist Tom Wolfe famously dubbed the 1970s the me decade. The idealistic communalism of the 1960s had curdled into a focus on self-actualization and individual fulfillment. But for the children of that era, this me focus often looked like parental neglect. The 70s child watched the heroes of their parents' generation fall. They saw the Watergate scandal, the end of the Vietnam War, and the energy crisis. In the 1950s, the government was a protector. In the 1970s, it was a source of deception and incompetence. This led to a psychological trait called institutional distrust. People who grew up in the 70s are statistically less likely to trust large corporations, government bodies, or experts. Their psychological internal locus of control is incredibly strong. They believe they are the masters of their own fate because they learned early on that the structures around them were unstable. If the gas station is empty and the president is lying, you'd better find your own way to get where you're going. In the absence of parents, the television became the primary psychological influencer. The 70s was the first decade where children were raised by electronic media. Consider the content. 1970s children's programming wasn't the sanitized educational content we see today. It was surreal and often dark. From the trippy visuals of HR poof stuff to the gritty reality of after-school specials that tackled divorce, drug abuse, and death, children were exposed to adult themes at an accelerated rate. This created a jadedness that is a hallmark of the 70s psychological profile. They are the generation that saw it all through a 19-inch screen. This constant stream of information without adult context led to a phenomenon called cognitive overload, where children developed a dry, sarcastic defense mechanism to process the chaos of the world. It's no coincidence that the 70s produced the icons of deadpan irony. Psychology isn't just about feelings, it's about resources. The 1970s were defined by stagflation, a brutal mix of stagnant economic growth and high inflation. For a child, this manifested as a palpable sense of scarcity. They saw their parents stressed about the price of eggs or waiting in mile-long lines for gasoline. This environment creates a psychological scarcity mindset. Even in times of plenty, those who grew up in the 70s often harbor a lingering fear that the rug could be pulled out at any moment. This resulted in a generation that is pragmatically focused on utility. They value things that work, things that last, and skills that are tangible. While the boomers were the dreamers, the 70s kids, the early Gen Xers, became the doers. Their psychological reward system is triggered by self-reliance and the accumulation of practical security rather than idealistic accolades. There is a common badge of honor among those who grew up in the 70s, the rub dirt on it mentality. The parenting style of the era was largely hands-off, emphasizing toughness. From a clinical perspective, this is a double-edged sword. On one hand, it built incredible resilience. 70s children are remarkably adaptable. They can handle a crisis without needing a trigger warning. They are the ultimate fixers. On the other hand, this environment often necessitated emotional suppression. In the 70s, children's feelings were rarely the center of the household conversation. Go outside and play was the universal answer to emotional distress. Consequently, many adults who grew up in this era struggle with alexithymia, a difficulty in identifying and expressing emotions. They are more likely to act on their feelings through work or physical activity than to talk through them in a therapeutic setting. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the 70s psychological profile is how it influenced the next generation. Because 70s children felt so unsupervised and unprotected, many became the helicopter parents of the 2000s. They looked at their own childhood, the biking miles away without a helmet, the empty houses, the stranger danger, and swung the pendulum in the opposite direction. The psychological reaction formation was intense. They wanted to provide the external locus of control they never had. Ironically, this has led to a generational clash. The 70s child, now an adult, values independence above all else, yet they often struggle to watch their own children experience the same productive struggle that forged their own identities. The psychology of the 1970s generation is a study in contradiction. It is a mix of high self-sufficiency and deep institutional skepticism, of adventurous risk-taking and vigilant anxiety, of incredible resilience and a tendency toward emotional isolation. They were the last generation to grow up in an analog world, the last to know what it feels like to be truly unreachable. In our hyper-connected, highly monitored modern age, the 70s psychological profile offers a valuable lesson. There is a profound strength that comes from being left alone to figure it out. If you grew up in the 70s, your latchkey wasn't just a tool to open a door. It was the key to a psychological fortress that you've been building ever since. You learned that the world can be dangerous, the leaders can be liars, and the gas might run out. But as long as you have your own two hands and a bit of rubbed-on dirt, you'll be just fine.